You understand me, don't you?
No, sir.
Bullseye!
For 9 straight years, Doug McClure played the cowboy every American living room trusted. Warm, funny, endlessly easygoing. Off camera, the real story looked nothing like that. While the Virginian was turning him into a household name, he was already on his second marriage, heading toward a third, then a fourth. He buried his own father in the same year his career hit its peak, and for decades he carried a private struggle that almost never made it into interviews or magazine profiles. This is the real gap between the man audiences thought they knew from Trampus and the one actually living behind that easy, sunlit smile. For weddings before the cameras ever slowed down in late 1961, Doug McClure married actress Barbara Luna, whom he'd met while working on the television series Overland Trail. Luna later recalled being drawn in almost immediately by his confidence and his sense of humor, the same qualities that would soon make him famous. What she didn't know yet was just how fast everything was about to change. Only a few months after the wedding, Doug was called in to audition for a new Universal Western called The Virginian. Luna remembered him coming home convinced he was up against a long list of other actors, the kind of pressure studios like to apply before locking in a contract. When she asked who else was reading for the part, Doug told her there wasn't anyone else. Whether or not that was the full picture, the outcome was real. Doug landed the role of Trampus, and within months he became one of the most recognized faces on American television. That kind of overnight success is supposed to be the good part of the story. For Doug's marriage, it wasn't. The demanding schedule and the sudden weight of fame created distance between him and Luna almost immediately, and by 1963, after roughly 2 years together, the marriage was over. Divorce filings from the time described tense arguments between the two of them, though decades later, Luna would still speak about Doug with genuine warmth rather than resentment, a pattern of staying on good terms with people even after everything fell apart that would follow Doug for the rest of his life. Here's the part that made this pattern so strange to the people who knew him. This wasn't Doug's first marriage, and it wouldn't be his last, not even close. Years earlier, while filming the war picture The Enemy Below in Hawaii in 1957, Doug met an opera singer named Faye Brash. The two married not long after, and their daughter, Tane, was born while Doug was still working to establish himself as an actor. That marriage ended in 1961, closing the very first chapter of his family life right before Barbara Luna entered the picture. After Luna, there would be 3 more marriages before his life was over. To understand why a man who seemed so easygoing on screen kept starting over behind closed doors, you have to go back further, to a childhood built almost entirely around horses, sports, and a version of the American West that Doug had actually lived, long before Hollywood ever asked him to perform it. The ranch hand behind the TV cowboy Douglas Osborne McClure was born on May 11th, 1935, in Glendale, California, to an accountant father and a mother who worked as a newspaper columnist. His childhood in West Los Angeles was about as stable as it gets, shaped by sunshine, the ocean, and constant outdoor activity rather than any early brush with hardship. He captained his school's football team, played basketball, surfed regularly, and by high school had his own horse and spent most of his free time riding it. The detail that mattered most for his future career came the summer before his senior year, when Doug spent 3 months working at the Holland Livestock Company, a large cattle ranch in Nevada. While a lot of young Californians only knew the American West through movies and books, Doug was waking up before sunrise, handling livestock, and living on a schedule dictated by weather rather than a studio clock. Years later, when he stepped into Western roles, he wasn't learning a lifestyle from scratch. He was returning to one he'd already lived. Even so, Doug didn't walk straight into acting with total confidence. After high school, he took drama classes at Santa Monica City College, then enrolled at UCLA with physical education as a deliberate backup plan in case the acting career never took off. His looks landed him modeling jobs and commercials during college, which slowly opened doors into small television roles, first in Men of Annapolis, then guest spots in Death Valley Days, Maverick, and a Twilight Zone episode. None of it made him famous yet, but it built the foundation producers would eventually notice. A real turning point came in 1957 with a supporting role in the war film The Enemy Below, starring Robert Mitchum and Kurt Jurgens. It wasn't a role with much room to shine, but working alongside major stars on a big production taught him things television simply couldn't, and filming on location in Hawaii is where he met his first wife. 3 years later, in 1960, Doug landed a small part in The Unforgiven, a much bigger production directed by John Huston and led by Burt Lancaster, Audrey Hepburn, Audie Murphy, and Lillian Gish. The shoot became notorious for its difficulties, including a horseback riding accident that seriously injured Hepburn while she was pregnant. Being on set for something that dramatic, even in a small role, gave Doug a front-row seat to how high-stakes filmmaking actually worked. Television gave him his biggest pre-Virginian opportunity that same year, when he landed the lead opposite William Bendix in NBC's Overland Trail, playing a young sidekick named Frank Flippin. The show only lasted 17 episodes, but it proved Doug could anchor a series. Right after it ended, he moved almost immediately into CBS's Checkmate, playing investigator Jed Sills for roughly 70 AP. When The Virginian ended in 1971, Doug McClure was only 36 years old, still young by Hollywood standards. Universal clearly believed in him, quickly lining him up for The Judge and Jake Weiler alongside legendary actress Bette Davis. The pilot didn't generate enough interest to become a full series, and the project was released only as a standalone television movie instead. The next opportunity many expected for Doug had closed almost as fast as it opened. He tried again in 1972 with Search, a science fiction detective series where he alternated leading duties with Anthony Franciosa and Hugh O'Brien. The premise, investigators using futuristic technology to solve crimes, felt fresh for its time and drew some positive attention, but not enough to keep it running past 2 short seasons. Doug was discovering something a lot of television stars from his era ran into. Audiences loved the specific character they already knew, but they weren't necessarily ready to follow that same actor into something completely different, no matter how much range he actually had to offer. Doug later summed up how strange that stretch felt with a joke rather than a complaint, saying he sometimes got the sense that people assumed he'd simply vanish from the industry altogether. In reality, he never stopped working. He kept showing up on sets, kept learning new lines, kept doing the job the same way he always had. What had changed wasn't his effort or his ability. It was how often the public actually saw him, since none of these post-Virginian projects came anywhere close to matching a weekly series watched by millions of households every single week for 9 straight years. Rather than chasing a repeat of Trampus-level fame, Doug quietly shifted his approach completely, and the genre he turned to next had almost nothing to do with cowboys at all. The dinosaur movies that quietly saved his career in the mid-1970s, Doug McClure became one of the more recognizable faces in a completely different kind of movie. Mid-budget fantasy adventure films based on the novels of Edgar Rice Burroughs. In 1974, he starred in The Land That Time Forgot, playing a man stranded on an island where prehistoric creatures still roamed. Critics weren't impressed, but audiences showed up anyway, both in theaters and later on television reruns, and that success opened the door to more of the same. 2 years later came At the Earth's Core, alongside horror icon Peter Cushing, taking viewers into an underground world of strange civilizations. In 1977, Doug returned to the character of Bowen Tyler for The People That Time Forgot, and by 1978 he'd added Warlords of Atlantis to the list. None of these films turned him into a box office giant, but they gave him a steady, distinct presence in a genre that decades later would earn a loyal cult following. Television work never slowed down either. Doug appeared in Barbary Coast alongside William Shatner, took part in the acclaimed miniseries Roots, and picked up guest spots across some of the biggest shows of the era, including Fantasy Island, Airwolf, Murder, She Wrote, and The Fall Guy. His last major regular television role came between 1987 and 1991, when he played Kyle Applegate, first the mayor and later the sheriff, on the fantasy sitcom Out of This World, introducing an entirely new, younger audience to Doug McClure without a single mention of Trampus. On paper, this looked like a comeback story about resilience, built almost entirely on his own willingness to keep showing up for smaller projects rather than waiting around for something as big as The Virginian to come along again. Off camera, during roughly this same stretch, Doug was dealing with something considerably heavier than typecasting, a private struggle that colleagues would only really discuss once he was gone. The bottle he fought while the cameras kept rolling. Several accounts from people who worked alongside Doug McClure during his 1970s adventure film years describe an actor who was quietly fighting alcohol, even while delivering reliable, professional performances on set. It's a detail that rarely made headlines while he was alive, in an era when actors were far more protected from that kind of story than they would be today, but it lines up with a pattern that kept surfacing throughout his adult life. Public steadiness paired with private struggle, a gap almost nobody watching from home had any real way of knowing about. That pattern extended well beyond drinking. In 1965, right as the Virginian was reaching the height of its popularity, Doug's father, Donald Reed McClure, died at age 61. The public was watching a rising television star at the peak of his career. Almost nobody was watching a son quietly grieving his father in the middle of that same success. Doug rarely spoke about it publicly, and it remained one of the heaviest private losses of his life. His marriages kept following a similar rhythm of public smiles and private restarts. He married Helen Crane in 1965, again at the height of the Virginian's fame, and that marriage ended by 1968, lasting only a few years despite Doug being, by every outward measure, one of the most successful men on American television at that exact moment. In 1970, he married Diane Soldani, and this one lasted longer, 9 years, and produced his second daughter, Valerie Diane. That stretch of the 1970s coincided with Doug searching for a new direction in his career after the Virginian ended, and for a while, family gave him a sense of stability his professional life couldn't. Even that relationship ended in divorce in 1979, making it his fourth marriage to collapse in. He continued accepting new projects throughout treatment, telling colleagues he didn't want to be seen as a patient before he was seen as an actor. That determination paid off with one of the most meaningful moments of his professional life when on November 16, 1994, he received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, a formal recognition of nearly 4 decades in the industry, arriving just as his body was beginning to fail him. Early in 1995, while filming in Hawaii, Doug collapsed on set. Colleagues initially feared a stroke or a serious heart problem, but tests back in Los Angeles revealed the cancer had spread to his liver and bones. He died on February 5, 1995, in Sherman Oaks, California, at 59 years old, just months short of his 60th birthday. He was buried at Woodlawn Memorial Cemetery in Santa Monica. His final film, Riders in the Storm, was completed while he was still fighting the illness and was only released to audiences after he had already passed away. There's one more detail that says a lot about how people actually felt about him. Years later, The Simpsons character Troy McClure was partly built as an affectionate nod to Doug, and according to his own daughter, Doug found the joke genuinely funny, with his kids sometimes calling him Troy behind his back just to make him laugh. His daughter Tane went on to build her own career as an actress and singer, while Valerie chose a quieter, more private path, and both kept their father's memory close for years afterward. So knowing everything he was quietly carrying behind that easy on-screen grin, what do you think finally made Doug McClure the kind of man his own children still wanted to tease? There's one more detail that says a lot about how people actually felt about him. Years later, The Simpsons character Troy McClure was partly built as an affectionate nod to Doug, and according to his own daughter, Doug found the joke genuinely funny, with his kids sometimes calling him Troy behind his back just to make him laugh. His daughter Tane went on to build her own career as an actress and singer, while Valerie chose a quieter, more private path, and both kept their father's memory close for years afterward. So knowing everything he was quietly carrying behind that easy on-screen grin, what do you think finally made Doug McClure the kind of man his own children still wanted to tease? Doug McClure's story was never simply about the cowboy audiences saw on television. Behind the familiar smile was a man whose career had moved through extraordinary highs and difficult personal chapters, yet somehow he continued to find reasons to keep moving forward. His years as Trampus had made him famous, but the years that followed revealed a different kind of determination. Instead of allowing one iconic role to define everything he could do, Doug continued taking opportunities wherever they appeared, moving between television, adventure films, westerns, and guest appearances with a consistency that was easy to overlook. For viewers who remembered him only from The Virginian, it might have seemed as though he had disappeared when the series ended, but the reality was very different. He was still working, still appearing on screen, and still finding ways to remain connected to an industry that had changed dramatically since the beginning of his career. What made his story especially memorable was that he never seemed desperate to recreate the exact fame he had experienced during the show's 9-season run. Instead, he accepted that his career had entered a different stage and continued building a body of work around it. His later appearances introduced him to audiences who had never watched The Virginian, proving that his appeal could survive beyond the character that had made him famous. Even when the roles became smaller, his presence remained recognizable. There was something familiar about Doug that audiences responded to, whether he was riding a horse in a Western, fighting prehistoric creatures in an adventure movie, or appearing in a completely different television series. That ability to remain recognizable without constantly depending on nostalgia became one of the most interesting parts of his later career. At the same time, his personal life had become much quieter. The series of marriages that had once followed one another so quickly had finally come to an end with Diane Funbogue, and the relationship gave Doug a kind of stability that had been missing from much of his earlier adult life. Their marriage lasted through the final 16 years of his life, including the period when his health began to deteriorate. For someone who had spent so much of his life constantly moving from one project to another, having someone beside him through those final years mattered in a way that fame could never replace. His final period also showed how seriously he continued to take his identity as an actor. Even after being diagnosed with lung cancer, he kept accepting work rather than allowing the illness to become the only thing people associated with him. He continued appearing on sets and working with people who had known him for decades. The Hollywood Walk of Fame star he received in November 1994 became a fitting recognition of a career that had lasted for almost 4 decades. It arrived at a difficult moment, but it also confirmed something Doug had spent his entire adult life proving. His career had mattered. From the early television appearances to The Virginian, from adventure movies to later television roles, he had remained part of the entertainment world for an unusually long time. His death in 1995 closed that chapter, but it did not erase the character audiences had come to love. Trampas remained one of the roles that defined classic American television, and Doug McClure remained inseparable from the warmth and humor he had brought to the character. Perhaps that is why the later joke involving Troy McClure became more than just a reference. It showed that even years after Doug's death, his name and image could still make people smile. His children remembering him with humor added another layer to that legacy. Instead of allowing his memory to become something distant or untouchable, they could still laugh about him, tease him, and remember the person behind the celebrity. And perhaps that is the most human part of Doug McClure's story. He was not remembered simply because he played a famous cowboy. He was remembered because, beneath the fame, the marriages, the career struggles, the private battles, and the final illness, there was a person his family still felt close enough to joke about. The cameras eventually stopped rolling, but the image of Doug McClure continued to live on through the characters he played, the people who worked beside him, and especially the family who knew the man behind the smile. What remains most striking about Doug McClure's life is how different his public image was from the complicated reality underneath it. Millions of people knew the easygoing cowboy, the man who could smile through trouble and make even a dangerous situation feel lighter. They saw Trampas as someone who could get into trouble, laugh about it, and somehow find his way out again. But the real Doug had spent much of his life dealing with circumstances that were far less simple. His career rose quickly, his personal relationships changed repeatedly, and the entertainment industry itself transformed around him. Yet through all of those changes, he continued to work. That persistence may have been one of the most important characteristics of his personality. Hollywood can be unforgiving to actors who become identified with one role, especially when that role becomes as successful as Trampas. For many performers, being remembered for one character can become both a blessing and a limitation. Doug experienced both sides of that reality. The Virginian gave him national recognition, financial security, and a character audiences genuinely loved, but it also created an expectation that was difficult for any later project to match. When the series ended, viewers had spent 9 years seeing Doug regularly. They had watched him grow familiar, watched his character become an important part of the show, and in a sense had invited him into their homes every week. When that routine disappeared, The connection naturally became less visible. But Doug never stopped being an actor simply because the audience stopped seeing him as often. He continued accepting roles and appearing wherever opportunities emerged. His adventure films were especially important because they allowed him to build a second identity on screen. Instead of trying to pretend that he was still the same television cowboy, he entered worlds filled with dinosaurs, underground civilizations, lost islands, and impossible adventures. Those movies may not have received the same critical attention as major Hollywood productions, but they gave him something equally valuable: longevity. They kept his face on screens at a time when many television stars from his generation were struggling to find meaningful work. His later television appearances served the same purpose. Each appearance reminded audiences that Doug was still there. He could step into a guest role, play a mayor, a sheriff, a detective, or another familiar authority figure, and immediately bring the confidence that had become part of his screen presence. By the time he appeared in Out of This World, an entirely new generation could watch him without necessarily knowing anything about the Virginian. That was significant because it meant his career had outgrown the audience that originally made him famous. His work had become part of a larger television history. But behind the professional persistence was a private life that had not always been easy. His marriages had repeatedly ended, and his struggles were not always visible to the public. The contrast between his cheerful screen personality and the difficulties he experienced away from the cameras made his story more complicated than the image many viewers carried. He had losses, disappointments, and periods when his personal life clearly did not match the success people saw on television. Yet those experiences did not completely change the way people remembered him. Instead, they made the warmth of his public personality seem even more significant. People who knew him often remembered someone who remained friendly and approachable, someone who could maintain relationships even after difficult chapters had ended. That quality may explain why his friendships could survive so many changes in his life. His bond with James Drury is one of the clearest examples. The two had spent years together on the Virginian, and their friendship continued long after the cameras stopped rolling. Their regular contact demonstrated that some relationships created during the height of fame were genuine enough to survive the end of the show that brought them together. For Doug, those friendships may have provided a sense of continuity while almost everything else around him was changing. Eventually, his health became the one challenge he could not simply work through. The lung cancer diagnosis in 1994 changed the final chapter of his life. But even then, he continued behaving as though work was part of who he was rather than simply a profession. He kept accepting projects and remained involved in acting while his condition worsened. That determination makes his final months especially poignant because he was still trying to live as an actor rather than allowing illness to completely redefine him. His Hollywood Walk of Fame star arrived during that final period, giving him a public acknowledgement that might have come years earlier under different circumstances. It represented nearly 40 years of work and recognized not just one television role, but an entire career. From small parts and guest appearances to major television success and international adventure films, Doug had managed to remain employed and recognizable across multiple eras of entertainment. His death in February 1995 came at only 59 years old, leaving behind